For centuries, humanity believed that survival depended on conquering nature, but as the 21st century arrived, that very mindset pushed global agriculture into a devastating crisis of biological collapse. This was precisely the tragedy faced by Charlie and Isabella at England's 200-year-old Knepp Estate. The estate's heavy clay soil drained them of £1.5 million British pounds, turning the farm into a debt-ridden biological wasteland. But instead of declaring bankruptcy or selling the land, they did something the entire agricultural community at the time considered absolute madness. They deliberately destroyed their own farm. They removed every fence, smashed the drainage system, set hundreds of wild animals free, and made one extraordinary decision: let the animals take over. No planning, no intervention, no machinery. What was dismissed as economic suicide became, exactly 25 years later, an ecological miracle unlike anything seen before. It not only brought back species that had been absent for 600 years, but, ironically, also generated enormous profits that far surpassed every model of modern intensive farming. Why is the digging and soil disturbance caused by a herd of wild animals considered by scientists to be a process of ecological restoration? And what truly happens when people decide to completely relinquish control over a piece of land on the brink of bankruptcy? What unfolded next at the Knepp Estate should never have been possible under the principles of modern agriculture. When an economic system collapses, investors typically seek new technological solutions or liquidate their assets. Stepping back, and handing over the physical management of the land to wild animals was regarded as a paradox that ran counter to the entire history of industrial agriculture. Yet, surface disturbance, structural irregularity, and the unpredictable impacts of animals turned out to be the very prerequisites for the formation of a complex and resilient ecological network. To analyze the scientific basis of this paradox, we need to revisit the ecological record. Before tractors and industrial fencing appeared, Europe was not a dark, closed canopy forest, as many 20th-century academic sources once described it. In the year 2000, ecologist Franz Vera proposed a controversial hypothesis: pre-agricultural Europe may not have been entirely covered by dense forest, but instead consisted of a constantly shifting mosaic of grasslands, scrublands, wetlands, and clusters of open woodland. According to him, large herbivores were among the forces that maintained this landscape structure. This spatial order was sustained by a remarkable force: vast herds of large herbivores such as European bison, wild horses, moose, and wild boars. These animals did not move without purpose. They followed the rhythms of the seasons. Through grazing, feeding on young leaves, physically breaking branches, and trampling the ground, they continuously created open spaces and prevented the formation of an unbroken belt of dense forest. The constant disturbance they produced formed the foundation for maintaining grassland corridors, providing habitats for tens of thousands of other species. Large herbivores were the continent's first ecosystem managers. But wait, if this natural system had operated with remarkable precision for hundreds of thousands of years, what truly pushed nature to the brink of crisis before restoration projects began? The era of intensive agriculture that emerged after World War II had a clear and urgent objective to maximize food production in order to rebuild society. Governments provided enormous financial support to remove natural hedgerows, drain wetlands, and expand the use of industrial chemicals. Paying farmers to carry out these actions was not an act of deliberate destruction. At the time, it was an economically rational and necessary decision. Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, the heirs to the Knepp Estate, did exactly what textbooks and agricultural authorities instructed them to do. They invested in heavy machinery, installed an expensive underground drainage system, and forced the clay soil to produce wheat at any cost. They followed every standard of industrial farming, creating vast fields completely devoid of wild plant life. The consequences of industrial production were reflected in devastating datasets. The collapse did not occur overnight, but unfolded as a systematic process of biological degradation. From a landscape that had once been extraordinarily rich, Knepp became a completely unbalanced surface. The foundation of the food chain was the first to break down. Continuous plowing and chemical use destroyed the underground networks of microorganisms and mycorrhizal fungi. Populations of earthworms and insects, the fundamental energy source of the ecosystem, declined severely. The shortage of basic food sources and the disappearance of protective scrubland boundaries immediately triggered the collapse of higher-level animal species. The native turtle dove, once common throughout the countryside, experienced a nationwide population decline of as much as 98%. The nightingale, a bird entirely dependent on specific types of vegetation, was reduced to exactly one recorded territory on the estate in the year 2005. The condition of larger species revealed the severity of the environmental crisis even more clearly. Wild white storks, an important indicator of wetland health, had been completely absent from the country's skies for 600 years. Biological statistics proved one undeniable truth: imposing order on clay soil with machinery not only drained financial resources, but also exhausted the land's most basic ability to sustain life. The estate was no longer a self-regulating ecosystem. It had become a depleted space capable of producing yields only through the continuous injection of synthetic chemicals. Chemicals and mechanized machinery were only the visible surface of ecological decline. The real problem existed at a deeper level, rooted in a management ideology, humanity's obsession with neatness and absolute order in physical space. For centuries, planning models assumed that nature had to be controlled through straight lines, perfect squares, and completely level surfaces. In a standard farming system, vegetation had to be trimmed regularly. And every element without direct economic value, such as a rotting tree trunk, a thicket, or a stagnant pool of water, was immediately removed because it was regarded as a nuisance. But wait, does this visual perfection truly make the entire system sustainable? Ecological data proves the exact opposite. A natural ecosystem operates in direct opposition to uniformity. It requires a certain degree of physical disorder, diversity in spatial structure, differences in vegetation height, and varying levels of light absorption. A tangled, thorny thicket is actually a fortress that protects small birds from predators. A pool of rainwater is an essential breeding ground for dragonflies and amphibians. A decaying tree trunk forms the foundation that nourishes networks of fungi and decomposing microorganisms. When industrial agriculture used mechanical force to flatten every difference, it stripped the landscape of its complexity, the very element that functions as the environment's immune system. The elimination of this small-scale diversity created enormous monoculture fields that were extremely fragile. Without natural buffer zones, a single pest outbreak or one period of extreme weather could place the entire area at risk of complete collapse. Humanity's absolute control, ironically, was precisely what caused the ecosystem to lose its ability to regulate and defend itself. The answer to the debt of £1.5 million British pounds did not come from a new generation of fertilizer or improved agricultural equipment. It came on one decisive morning, when Charlie and Isabella organized the auction of their entire fleet of plows and combine harvesters and sold off their traditional dairy herd. This transformation was carried out with absolute caution. The transition did not occur across the entire estate at the same time. Knepp was divided into 3 zones, north, central, and south, with each area leaving production at a different point in time. Some sections were reseeded with native grasses and flowers, while the southern block was left to regenerate naturally for several years before longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, Tamworth pigs, and deer were introduced at low densities. These differences allowed the research team to observe how varying levels of intervention created completely different landscapes. But could those physical impacts truly restart the food chain, or would they merely create an even more devastated wasteland? Animals do not flatten the landscape. They create a form of systematic disturbance. Field observations have documented remarkably clear chains of ecological cause and effect. When Tamworth pigs use the force of their snouts to break through the hard crust of the ground, they expose the moist soil beneath. This action brings the seeds of native plants which had remained buried underground for decades because they were deprived of light into direct contact with sunlight. Soon afterward, pioneer vegetation begins to grow. The depressions created by the pigs collect rainwater and become isolated pools. Populations of insects and beetles quickly move into these pools to reproduce. The increase in insects immediately attracts predatory birds. The chain of life is reactivated from the bottom upward. Meanwhile, Exmoor ponies consume tough, thorny shrubs, while longhorn cattle disturb the grassland in separate patches. They are not destroying the ecosystem, they are reshaping the living space, creating a complex, multi-dimensional environment. The long wait began to produce real, measurable results. 2 decades of wildlife absence across the countryside were finally broken. One night, Charlie and Isabella recorded the songs of dozens of nightingales, echoing from the blackthorn thickets. These thorny shrubs had once been dismissed as weeds that obstructed farming, but they had now become the perfect habitat for birds to build nests and protect their young. The most symbolic event took place in the year 2020. After years of establishing a reintroduced population at Knepp, a bird born within the project paired with an unringed wild stork and built a nest at the top of an oak tree in the southern block. 3 chicks hatched successfully. Another pair produced one more chick only a few weeks later. This was the first successful breeding of white storks in England since the year 1416. The event provided undeniable biological evidence species are always ready to re-establish their populations when they are given a space that matches their biological needs. The good news was that life had returned with extraordinary force, and ecological indicators had risen sharply. But the practical truth was this wild landscape could not operate 100% independently. No automated system could overcome the spatial limits of a privately owned area. Because the estate covers only 3,500 acres, the animals do not have unlimited space to move when food supplies decline. If livestock populations were allowed to expand without the presence of large predators, they would quickly consume all newly emerging vegetation and disrupt the ecological structure. To prevent this, humans still have to intervene through physical management. Ecologists continuously conduct biological surveys and strictly calculate the number of animals per hectare. They establish schedules for moving livestock through different grazing blocks, giving the land time to recover. Herd sizes are controlled every year. At the same time, some migratory birds are fitted with satellite tracking devices to monitor their routes. This is a carefully managed wild system, where interventions are calculated to maintain stable natural indicators. But every major transformation encounters resistance. Turning agricultural land into an area filled with wild vegetation ignited an unavoidable confrontation. The transition was far from smooth. It triggered an intense legal and social conflict. Traditional farmers in neighboring areas strongly opposed the project, describing Knepp as an alarming wasteland of weeds capable of spreading seeds into their cultivated fields. This transformation of the landscape was seen as a rejection of traditional values of labor. The authorities responsible for financial management were equally confused. The public funding system had not been designed for this model. They could not continue providing agricultural subsidies to a place that no longer produced grain, yet they also could not classify this privately owned experimental area as a national conservation site. This created a prolonged policy vacuum. Nevertheless, over time, the tensions were gradually resolved through objective data. Even some of the project's strongest opponents changed their views when geological analyses showed that their groundwater had become significantly cleaner. The natural filtration capacity of Knepp's porous soil and root systems prevented residual agricultural chemicals from seeping into the shared aquifer. As the populations of white storks, nightingales, and purple emperor butterflies increased, they could not remain sustainable over the long term within the limits of 3,500 acres. Confining populations to a fixed area would eventually reduce genetic diversity. Knepp's success helped drive Weald to waves, an initiative established in the year 2021 to create a natural corridor approximately 100 miles long, stretching from the High Weald to the Sussex coast. The project aims to connect more than 20,000 hectares of habitat through the voluntary cooperation of landowners, businesses, conservation organizations, and local communities. Knepp became the core zone of a 100-mile ecological corridor. Instead of remaining an isolated area, the project persuaded hundreds of landowners, local organizations, and businesses to cooperate in creating continuous strips of connected habitat. The goal is to link ancient inland woodlands, follow river catchments, and extend all the way to the kelp reefs in the ocean. By creating continuous ecological corridors, natural spaces begin reconnecting chains of interaction that had been broken apart. Wildlife gains safe routes for movement and genetic exchange. Water flowing through wetlands is filtered before reaching the sea, protecting marine ecosystems. This marks a transition from managing individual parcels of land to designing ecological planning at the regional level. Knepp does not survive on a single source of income. The estate combines meat from naturally grazing animals, safari tours, camping, accommodation, retail shops, and a wide range of visitor experiences. Its nature tourism division alone was once reported to generate approximately £800,000 in annual revenue, with a profit margin of around 22%. This figure reflects the performance of one specific business division, not the profit of the entire estate. New mechanisms such as biodiversity net gain and carbon markets may create additional funding sources for land restoration projects. However, these markets are still developing and should not be portrayed as the primary financial engine behind Knepp's success. The more important lesson is that an unprofitable agricultural property can build multiple new revenue streams when the value of its landscape, wildlife, and nature-based experiences is integrated into its business model. The white storks have completed their flights across continents to re-establish their presence. The once exhausted clay soil has now become highly profitable, providing datasets that help lawmakers restructure management systems. But the real question is not whether nature is capable of recovering. The greatest question, and also the deepest philosophical challenge, is this: can this ecosystem continue to survive and develop if one day humans stop carefully calculating grazing densities, stop physically intervening to manage different areas, and stop using financial markets such as carbon credits to protect it? The survival of a natural landscape in the modern world remains tightly bound to economic indicators and human management. The final image leaves us with a profound reflection on one of life's paradoxes. A perfectly planned field may be covered in brilliant golden wheat, yet beneath it still lies a biologically lifeless environment. Meanwhile, a landscape that appears constantly disturbed, uneven, and filled with mud churned up by the snouts of wild pigs may sometimes be the only place where the true pulse of life begins. What do you think about the dependence of the natural environment on modern economic models? Leave your opinion in the comments below, and keep following us to discover the latest information about global ecosystems. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.